Well, you know, my talk is Noteworthy Notes, Not All Note-Taking is Created Equal. Not all introductions are created equal. That was a truly awesome one. Thank you. There's nothing quite like getting in front of an audience after having just having them just been told your weakness. The good news is that I guess from here I can only impress you after you've seen my cooking. I should say I did warn Joe in advance that cooking was not my forte, and he still, to his credit, had the fortitude to try the dish that I made, and he didn't die. So, you know, there is benefit there.
That's why we paired you up with Chris.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway, I want to talk to you about notes today, and it seems to go without saying that notes are important. So lots of students take notes, most students take notes, and most students value the notes that they take. And in fact, there's a lot of literature showing that done properly, note-taking can improve learning. Not everyone does it properly, and that's an issue we'll be talking a little bit about today, but done properly it can. The reason I start with this is because I have written for grants where people have responded, but why would we care about note-taking? Note-taking is so obvious. Everybody can, you know, some people take notes, some people don't. Why would we want to know more about it? And it turns out it's one of the reasons that we should know more about it is because everybody does it, and most people do it wrong. So good note-taking is really, really, really hard. If you think about what's happening, and some of you may be taking notes on what I'm saying today, you have to understand what I'm saying. But I'm talking really fast. I in particular am talking really fast, but even normal speed speakers are talking really fast. And so people are you're trying to understand what I'm saying, make sense of it, write it down. You probably can't write down everything, so you're translating it into your own words. You're figuring out what's important and what's not important. All of these things are happening at once, and while you're writing what I said in the last minute, I'm saying something new. So you're splitting your attention, trying to learn what I'm saying now while still remembering what I said just a moment ago, and this is really hard. In fact, it's so hard that researchers in note-taking have estimated it's as difficult as playing a game of chess. This here is a person taking notes on a game of chess, and I can only imagine that if you are taking notes on chess playing, it's even more difficult, right? So the thing is that note-taking can serve multiple purposes, and this makes it even harder. So one reason we take notes is to have an external record of what happened. And that's obviously straightforward. If you've taken notes, you can reference them later, and that's useful. But a secondary purpose of taking notes that I would actually say for educational purposes is a primary reason for taking notes is that taking notes can actually help you learn. The process of taking notes can help you encode information more deeply. And it's this trade-off. The problem is that to the extent that I really think deeply about material, oh sorry, I made a transition error. Sorry, you throw me off my game with the thing. But I was going to say is that you know, external storage is very good, but there can be trade-offs between the amount you learn and the amount you externally store. And different types of domains lead to different benefits and drawbacks of that. So one of the things that's really interesting about note-taking, at least today, is that if you look at a modern classroom, and this is a modern classroom, this is one of my classrooms, and you may note something about that classroom if you pay attention, which is that there's a lot of little Apple logos. Right, lots and lots and lots of little Apple logos, right? And for those students who don't have an Apple logo in front of them, it's not because they don't have a computer open. It's because their computer is a PC which doesn't have the glowing Apple logo. Most of the students in my classrooms are taking notes via laptop these days. And in fact, it ranges depending on the school, but in surveys that have been done, usually the low end is about 20% and the high end is about 80%. And then it differs especially if some classes say, you know, you're not allowed to use laptops. That obviously makes it so that fewer use laptops, and other schools give out laptops to all of their students. And in fact, the laptop movement is getting younger and younger. So it's always been the case in the last few years that college students are taking notes on laptop, but now we're starting to see high school students being issued laptops and some junior highs being issued laptops. And because I do work in laptops and note-taking, I get sent lots of emails about various elementary schools that are now trying to get students to use laptops in the classroom. And you know, the modern generation comes in and they're so used to using computers, they're not sure necessarily how to do other things. And so this could be a problem. So the question is, do laptops actually help note-taking? And certainly from the perspective of external store, the answer has to be yes, for a couple of reasons. The first of which is you can read the writing you've done on a laptop, and if your writing is anything like mine, you can't necessarily read the notes you've taken by hand. So certainly it creates an external store. It may be easier to save information on a laptop because then you can search for it with a search function. So, you know, you've got a notebook full of handwritten notes, you can't find what you're looking for, and it's easier on a laptop. People can typically type faster on a laptop than by longhand, so they can record more content. So there's a lot of reasons to think that for the purpose of external store, laptops are really good. But there are some problems with laptops. The first and most obvious of them is, of course, the distraction issue, which is that laptops might be great for people who are actually on task, but laptops are really great for not being on task as well. And so I'm sure many of you have noticed that some of your students are surfing the web, they're shopping, they're watching movies, they're playing games, they're doing, checking email. I've heard reports of some very disturbing things that people are doing in the classroom, watching things they really shouldn't be watching in a classroom. This person here is playing chess, which I think is particularly notable because, you know, it's just as difficult as taking notes. It's just a very different thing to be doing. So laptops can be distracting, and the evidence shows that not only we were bad at split attention, if you're using your laptop and you're also chatting with your friends, you're not going to learn as much, and that's sort of obvious. But what's also interesting is that if you have a laptop, you're not just distracting yourself. There's a cone of distraction behind you that anybody who can see your laptop screen while you're watching, you know, the latest Disney movie is also sort of watching the latest Disney movie out of the corner of their eye, and they are distracted as well. So there's this huge distraction issue. I'm not going to talk any more about that. We all know distraction is bad. We all know that our students should be on task. Our students know they should be on task. The fact that they're not always on task, well, even if you don't have laptops, sometimes they're not on task. But I want to talk about a different problem, which is this depth of processing issue. Because as I said before, laptops are great for external storage. If you want a record of what was said, they're great. But how do they influence our ability to learn from taking notes? That is, note-taking can help us learn. Do laptops help with that? And here's the thing, people type faster than they can handwrite. And what that means is that it is possible, with speakers who speak slower than I do anyway, to write down word for word what the speaker is saying. Not all of what the speaker is saying, not through the whole lecture, but you can get chunks of what the speaker is saying verbatim. And the thing about writing things down verbatim is you don't have to understand them to do that. If I were to suddenly start giving nonsense syllables, you could record those without understanding a word that I'm saying. So since you don't have to understand verbatim notes, and you actually sometimes will talk to court reporters who are taking verbatim notes, and afterwards you say, so what was the case about? And they'll say, I have no idea. It was, you know, in one ear and out my fingers, I guess, is the sort of way it went. You know, like you're just typing the words and you're not processing them. But if you can't write every word down, then you have to be able to figure out what to write down and how to phrase it in your own words. And in order to do that, you do have to understand it. So this is a deeper level of processing. You have to understand what's being said and translate it into your own words, and that is the sort of depth of processing that really helps learning. So it's harder, but this is what we call a desirable difficulty. And I know later we're going to be learning about how do we detect what's going to be a desirable difficulty. But one sort of thing is forcing yourself to process information more deeply is probably good most of the time, although maybe I'm going to be corrected on that. So this leads to deeper processing for handwriters. And so we wanted to test this hypothesis. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring people into a lab, and we're going to randomly assign them to either take notes on a laptop or take notes by hand. And our laptops have all been internet disabled, so they cannot be checking Facebook or email or watching things. They are all on task. We also have a research assistant standing behind them so they can see the screens. And all of our students are on task. And they have to take notes. We show them a TED Talk. We have a variety of different TED Talks. They range on things like how bats sleep, to how to make bread, something maybe I should have paid attention to things on geopolitics, to computer algorithms, a wide variety of talks. They were united by the fact that they were all short, but they all simulated lectures you might get in a classroom, and they were all on topics that we didn't expect students to know a lot about on average coming in. Then they were distracted for a short amount of time. We had one that was just, I had to do another study, and so I threw it in there because, you know, once you got the subjects in the lab, you run as many studies on them as you can. And the other one, which was a working memory task to determine how well individual differences in working memory, because we thought that might actually matter. It doesn't, so I'm not going to talk about it again. And then at the end, they were asked to answer both factual recall questions and conceptual questions about the material. and they were tested, and then we scored them. So in terms of what do I mean by factual recall and conceptual questions, well, a factual recall question, they watched a video on Turkey and how Turkey is managed to have a democracy and is mostly secular, at least until the events recently. But this research took place over a year ago. And so how is it that Turkey has managed to do this when other countries in the region have been less successful in this way? So for a factual question, after they've taken notes on this and done their distractor task, they might be asked, in what year did Turkey have its first free elections? And this is a Turkey having its first free election. The jokes only go downhill here from here. If you don't like that one, it's just going to get really bad. There's also, and a conceptual question would be something like, Turkey maintained independence after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. How did this lead to a more liberal Islamic culture in Turkey compared to other Middle Eastern countries? So this one, all you have to do is memorize a date, whereas this one you have to actually understand the concepts being articulated and then answer a question that requires some sort of synthesis afterwards. So here's what the results look like. What we see here on the left is factual questions. There is no difference between taking notes on laptop versus by hand. I should say, what we've got here is the z-scores. People are better at some of the domains than others. People are better at Turkey than they were at computer algorithms. So we z-scored everything so we can look at it all on the same scale. The effects don't really differ by domain, just the average scores. So in terms of factual content, people are equally good, regardless of whether or not they're using laptops or longhand. But in the conceptual, you get a stunning difference where people do much, much better when they take notes by hand than when they take notes by laptop, which is what we were predicting. Now, the reason for this, we said, is that people who are taking notes by hand are more likely to use their own words because they have to use their own words. So, to test this, we took all of their notes and we put them into a computer program that looked at the amount of verbatim overlap with the actual lecture, because we had a transcript of the lectures. And what we can see is that, indeed, people who took notes by laptop used much more verbatim note-taking. And you may say, well, that's great that they use that, but is that what is responsible for the failures? And the answer is yeah. There's a strong relationship both in the laptop and longhand scores. Basically, in general, you are better off using your own words. People in the laptop condition don't use their own words, but even in the longhand condition, you're better off when you don't use verbatim note-taking. Some people take more of that than others. So in general, the synthesis required to think about what is the person saying and put it into your own words helps you understand it better so you can answer better conceptual questions. Well, if that's the case, then we've solved the laptop problem. Because even though people are bad with note-taking on laptops, all we have to do is get them to use laptops, but use their own words. So this is straightforward, so we went ahead and tried this. We said people who take class notes on laptops when they are expected to be tested on the material later, tended to transcribe what they're hearing without thinking about it. Please try not to do this as you take notes today. Take notes in your own words. Don't just write down word for word what the speaker is saying. So we give them explicit instructions on this. And then we do the same sort of task. And what we find is, here we actually find a difference between longhand and laptop in factual. It goes back and forth study by study. Sometimes we find it, sometimes we don't. But the really important thing is that here in this conceptual condition, we replicate that people do much better with longhand, and the intervention does absolutely nothing. Why does the intervention do absolutely nothing? Because people still take notes verbatim when they're on laptops, even though we've told them not to take notes verbatim. Now, we've thought a lot about this. Why is this going to be the case? And we think what might happen is that, first of all, I don't know if any of you have ever tried this, but there is an unbelievable temptation, even when you know you're about to take notes verbatim, even when you know it's bad, because it's so much easier. You don't have to think about it. You can just type it and you're like, what if I get it wrong? What if the person says something and I'm missing some nuance? If I use their words, I don't have to worry about missing the nuance. So I'm just going to write it down word for word. And even when you know you shouldn't be doing that, it's really hard to resist the urge to do it. The second thing is, I think people aren't necessarily aware that they're taking notes verbatim. So they say, oh yeah, of course I'd use my own words. Because it's not like they're taking 100% verbatim. You look at these numbers, I mean, they're taking 10 to 12% verbatim, but it's still enough to make this difference. So they don't think of themselves in that way. But I actually don't have any data on the metacognition of it. That was just mere speculation. Still, I think that's interesting in that sense. Well, when we originally did this, we were surprised that this intervention didn't work, but we started talking to people about these findings, and they kept saying, well, that's great. It really works well for helping people learn, but The problem is you don't have as good an external store, right? People have more verbatim notes, so it's a better external store. And actually, people end up writing more when they are on a laptop. So they have a better external store, and that will make up for it. Because sure, right out, 10 minutes later, I remember what I learned. But you give me 2 weeks, or later in the quarter, I'm not going to remember anything that happened in that lecture unless I look at my notes. So I want a better record to learn from. That's what's really important. So in an actual educational setting, they say the external storage is more important than the actual production value. And that's a plausible hypothesis, so we went out to test it. So this external storage question is when there's a lot of evidence that a lot of times you can offload something from memory and it makes it a lot easier. So there's work, Teeny, Matlock et al. Have shown that people who are allowed to use Scrabble tiles are much better at creating words than if they have to keep the letters in their heads, because they have more working memory in their heads if it's offloaded to the tiles in front of them. This person's not going to do well regardless, but this is what my tiles always look like when I play Scrabble. But this external storage could make a big difference. All right, so we do the same study, except this time after they don't ever get tested immediately. There's no testing here at the first time, but they come back a week later. And we divided them, it's a 2x2 design. Half of them were randomly assigned to laptops, half were randomly assigned to longhand as before, but now half of them get to review their notes and half of them don't get to review their notes. So, pretty straightforward. This slide is really complicated. I'm going to walk you through it. The first thing to pay attention to is the fact that if people cannot review their notes, it does not matter if they took notes by longhand or laptop, they do terribly. So a week is about as long as an undergraduate can keep information in mind about a lecture without reviewing their notes, it appears, or at least in our study where they may not care so much. So we see that they just do badly in the no study conditions. So we're just going to forget about the no study conditions because there's just floor effects there. And let's take a look at what happens laptop versus longhand. First of all, we find people do much better in the factual condition with the laptop than the longhand, which we have never seen effects that big when we do it immediately. So that's sort of interesting. And secondly, we replicate this conceptual difference. So how is it possible, if the laptop users have better notes to study from, or at least more complete notes to study from, that they still do worse when they have access to their notes and can study, especially given the no study condition shows that they obviously forgot everything in between week 1 and week 2. And here's what it is. Having a more complete record is not the same as having a better record. All right? So if I wrote down 20 pages of notes and then I have 15 minutes to study those, that means I'm not spending a lot of time on each given page. I have to spread my attention over all of it. If I only put down 3 pages of notes, but those 3 pages of notes happen to have those factual details that are going to be tested on later because you took good notes, that's really helpful. And you're actually going to be better studying from those abridged notes, if you will. Moreover, people who learned and understood it originally, when they read it the second time, they're like, oh yeah, I remember that. I remember why Turkey has free and fair elections. That makes sense to me. I learned it then. I get a little refresher now. Totally got it. Whereas people the first time through didn't learn it, now they're looking at it and they're like, I don't even remember this stuff. I have no understanding of this material. I have to learn it from scratch right now from my notes. And that's harder than reminding yourself of something you once knew. So what's amazing about this is we actually find this persists even after delay. Yeah, so that was what I was supposed to do to make it so that you weren't looking at a ridiculous slide full of many bars that you can't make sense of. Yeah. Okay, so in case you were wondering, we do replicate once again this difference in verbatim note-taking, which is driving this effect. And I want to say, all of our studies that I did, and me and Pam Mueller, who was my co-author on this, we did them in a lab where we randomly assigned people to condition. This study has since been replicated a number of times, oftentimes in real classrooms instead of the lab, and sometimes where people get to choose whether they use a laptop or take notes by hand. It's a little messier that way. It's harder to make inferences because, when you're in a classroom, they may be on Facebook, and that could be a problem. When they're in a classroom, and when they're choosing themselves, it could be that people the better students choose to write by hand. Harder to make inferences about those studies, but the fact that we can replicate the finding in the real world and in the lab suggests converging evidence that this is something that's not just an artifact of the lab. I wanted to briefly, so here's the thing. What we can do is we can look at these from real world and lab studies, and we see that there's more verbatim notes in laptops than on longhand. But there's also a lot of stuff that just isn't written down at all. And actually studies that are not mine have shown that oftentimes if you average over many students in many classrooms and many studies, you find that students write down about 50% of the important material, of the main points that the instructor is trying to get across. This person hasn't written down any of it. But, geez, tough crowd today. All right. All right. So the question that's really important that I ask is, well, how do students know what to write down? How do students determine what is important? And I'm just going to take a brief step back now because although I am doing this research on note-taking, I've done some other education research, my actual primary line of research is not in education. I'm a decision scientist. I study how people make decisions. And a lot of my work is on how people determine what information is important in making a decision. And I was thinking about this and I thought, that's a really important question for education as well. Because we are constantly being given, you assign textbooks or give lectures, and some of it is absolutely critical, and some of it is examples of the concept to make the concept clearer, but the specifics of the example don't matter, and other things are seductive details or are just other random things that are in the book to give it girth, or other things the book has important things, but it also has stuff that's not relevant to this class, but it's in there, and you assign it because it's still the best explanation. And so you expect your students to be able to weed through what is useful and what is not useful, and identify what's important and what is not important. Something we do every day in our emails. So I wanted to look at how people do this, or how well people do this. And so here's what I did. We took textbook passages across a number of different disciplines. And these were textbook passages that professors used in their introductory courses. So we went to introductory professors and we said, what are your readings? Give us a reading, short 2 or 3 page reading. And then we asked the professor to go through and underline what it is from this reading that they think is important. What it is that they want their students to get from this reading. So professors do this. Then we take a clean version of the same reading and we give it to students. And we say, we went to a professor and we asked the professor, what is the important stuff? And we want you to identify the important stuff too. So pretend you're in this person's class, pretend you're going to be taking a test, you're underlining as though you're trying to understand what's important, what's going to be tested, etc. We use the professor's knowledge as sort of an accurate statement that if the professor thinks that this is important, it is. At very least, it's important for the sake of the test. And the question was, how well do students do at identifying the important information in the textbook compared to what the professor says is important? And to test this, we looked at all of what they underlined, and we looked at 2 things. The first is discrimination, which is how much of what is underlined is actually important. Now, obviously, this person is not doing a good job of discrimination, and you may have looked at students, they come to your office hours like, I don't know what's going wrong. You say, okay, show me your textbook, and it's this. And you're like, well, one of your problems is that you don't discriminate between what's important and not. You're studying everything as though it's equal. We also looked at coverage, which is how much of what is important is actually underlined. So this person's doing a great job of coverage, but you also will see people who are not doing such a great job of coverage. They're missing crucial stuff. And in our note-taking, as I said, 50% of the important points were not recorded. So I'm just going to show you the data. I want you to spend a second and think about what sorts of discrimination and coverage rates would you expect to see? What would you think that students would be able to do? How much of what is important do you think they actually identify as important? And how much of what they actually underline is actually important? And what would you want it to be? So think about those questions for a moment. I'm going to let you do that before I throw up the data. And the actual answer is that both of them hover around 30%, which means that students are only successfully identifying 30% of the information that is important. And of what they think is important, only 30% actually is. And I find that really disturbing, personally. And this, by the way, these are done on Princeton students. We've replicated this at UCLA. These are not dumb students. These are good students. And they're still doing really badly at this. So we thought, okay, well, maybe the problem is that we just took students randomly from the populations, and maybe there's something about, yesterday in the panel, one of the questions was about whether or not disciplinary knowledge is important for understanding these sorts of broader questions. And maybe the problem is that we're asking psychology majors about sociology. They don't know any sociology, so they can't distinguish what's important from what's not. And that once people get better at something, they'll do better. So what we did is we got poli-sci majors and psych majors, and then people who were neither. And we also had some psych graduate students that I'll throw in a later analysis. And in this case, it was done on a computer instead of on handwritten. It turns out that when you do it with handwritten and have them underline, the coding process for the research assistants is nightmarish as they go through and have to identify every word that has been underlined and whether it is correct or not. So when you do it, so we did it this way, and it's just you click on a sentence and the sentence highlights itself, and that makes it more simple for coding purposes. But the other thing about this that's worth noting is that when you click a sentence, the whole sentence gets highlighted, which is, you'll see, is going to change the rates a little bit, because I may have thought the first half of the sentence was important, and really it's the second half of the sentence is important, but I still get the points. So anyway, they click on a sentence to mark it as important, and we have 2 profs in the department mark the importance to allow comparisons. The profs agree pretty highly. It's in the 80% plus range for the profs agreeing with each other, so it seems like there is something objective about what is important for the purposes of the discipline. And then how do the students do in the disciplines? And here's what we find. As I said, they do a little better here. You're getting up to, at least in psychology, they do better. But what you note is that they don't do better because they're psychology majors. That is, psychology, poli-sci, other majors, they all do equally well at both coverage and discrimination in psychology. This is not a significant difference, that little red bar up there. And in political science, they also don't do any. Being a political science does not give you, major does not give you an advantage in political science. So it seems like this disciplinary knowledge is not translating into their ability to do this, although it does seem that psych is maybe a little easier than political science. I don't want to take too much about that, because it could be just that this particular passage in psychology was easier than this particular passage in political science, and so I don't want to make broad generalizations there. But that is that. But we also thought, well, maybe there's a difference between what year they are. Freshmen don't know anything. Seniors have been in university for 4 years, so they know something and they're going to be better. And the graduate students should be even better than that. So here's what that looks like. And there are a couple things to note, which is that the freshmen actually do better than the sophomores, juniors, and seniors. So it seems that after going to university, they are getting worse at identifying important information, if anything. But I also want to point out these 2 bars. Those are the psych graduate students who are doing the psych tasks. And they do considerably better at the psych stuff. They don't do better in the political science. So in terms of disciplinary usefulness, there is potentially something about disciplinary knowledge, but that's not knowledge that seems to matter at the level of the undergraduates, even by the time they're seniors, which is somewhat disturbing. And here's another problem. We can't tell whether there's a selection effect going on here. That is, we can't tell if graduate training is actually making people better at determining what's important, or if instead we just have the people who were good at figuring out what's important in psychology, they're the ones who go to grad school in psychology. So as encouraging as this was when I first saw it, as I think about it now, it may just be a selection effect that we're looking at, and that's not ideal. But I think the take-home message here is that people aren't very good at determining what's important, and that is true even in the major and even in the discipline and even after a lot of experience, and that is perhaps a problem. So I'm going to spend a moment moving away from data and soapboxing. So, yesterday we were challenged to think about what the purpose of a university was. This is not the first time I've thought of this. It's something that I think a lot about. And one of the speakers in the panel mentioned that, with Google in your pocket, facts are not as useful as they used to be. It used to be in the 80s, if you wanted to know something, you wanted to know what a term was, you wanted to know what acetylcholine did, you wanted to know something, you had to look it up. And how are you going to look it up? You go onto like an encyclopedia? You go to the library and start searching through the card catalog? I mean, it took forever. So what did you do? You went to college, you memorized it, and then you knew it, and that was useful. These days, you want to know what it is, you just Google it. You have your Google in your pocket 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Wikipedia will give you the basic summary. If you want more detail, there's links to the actual articles and research that was done. My goodness, why do we need to know facts anymore? So what do we need to know? Well, it seems to me that in a world where when you Google something like, I want to know what a particular neurotransmitter does, you get 10,476,220 links. What you want to be able to do is determine what is good information and what is bad information, what is important information and what is tangential information. So it's no longer about being able to know information so much as being able to use and evaluate information, to synthesize information, etc. And so this is why these particular findings bother me so much, because if what we're trying to train students to do in the modern cyber generation, I don't know what generation we would call it, I'm calling it cyber, but if that's what we want them to do, then one of the most crucial things they should be able to do is determine what's important and what's not. And they're not learning that at all, except maybe in grad school, and maybe not even then. So I find that very disturbing. Now, sometimes when I talk about this sort of thing, people say, well, that's okay, because you can signal what's important. And in fact, I just went to a workshop yesterday where we learned a little bit about signaling. And this is something that it's supposed to help students a lot, which is you highlight, this is what's important. And that's going to be useful. And I have a man with a fish here because you can give a man a fish and he can eat for a year, but can you teach a man to fish so that he can do it? It's great. I can tell my students this is important in this class. But if they can't transfer that to figuring out what's important in other contexts, I'm not actually doing them any service there, because great, they know it's important here, but they haven't learned how to figure out what's important. I've often thought that by forcing them to struggle without signaling, that could help them be better at importance. That doesn't seem to be working. Signaling doesn't seem to be working. I have some other studies where we do signal and they do better on those tasks, but then we give them another task and they don't do any better on those. Like, getting to see what a professor has highlighted in one passage that the professor has assigned does not help people do any better at a second passage that professor has assigned. So the signaling thing doesn't seem to be working for transfer. And I wanted to say one last thing before I sort of wrap up and allow questions. And that is, have you ever looked at what textbooks signal? Like, pull out a textbook that you assign and look at what it signals. Look at what it bolds. Because if I were to say to you, something is bolded in a text, what would that mean to you? What is the sort of pragmatics of that sort of symbol? Something is bolded. To me, that means, oh, this is important, pay attention. To most textbooks, it's a convention that means this is a word we haven't used before. Which is a very different thing than this is important. And actually, if you start looking at what textbooks are doing, what they're highlighting, what they're underlining, etc., they don't seem to be using any conventions I'm aware of the actual this is important. You look at the end of, test your knowledge, and a lot of textbooks, the test your knowledge questions seem to be randomly drawn from the textbook, not on what you care that the students know, but just sort of like on page 30, like almost like you got an intern to read the textbook and choose random sentences and then test people on them. And I hope if any of you are textbook instructor, have written textbooks, that you either didn't write those or you did and yours are good, or anyway, don't take offense at this, hopefully. But it's really actually very disturbing. And some work done outside of my lab was looking at what teachers, and this is at the high school level, are teaching and testing. And what they found is that if there's a 10-paragraph essay that students are assigned, and there are 10 questions on the exam, most of the time you will have coverage that they are doing, one question from each paragraph. And the goal stated by the teachers is, I want to make sure the students have read the whole thing. And how do I do that? I have to test from every part. Which is not I want to make sure that students have read the important stuff and understand the important stuff and understand the difference between important stuff and unimportant stuff. And since that's the way that many teachers actually go about testing, students learn everything is equally important, or it's arbitrary what's important, or how am I supposed to know what's important? And then they can't transfer beyond that. I have one more thing to say here, and I don't have a slide on it, although I was going to make one last night, but then I had a deadline of, I had to get this into Joe, or else he would show embarrassing photos of me making bad Indian food. So I recently ran a study where we had students do this task where they underlined on many, many different passages. And I was looking to see if there were some students who were better than others. The idea being, well, if there's some students who are consistently good at this, what are they doing? Is there something that they're doing? Are they underlining the first sentence? Are they underlining, causally central ideas? Are they underlining vocabulary words? Like, what are they doing that's making them successful? And I was stunned to realize that there was a zero correlation between how well people did on one and how well they did on the other. So we had people who literally were getting 100% coverage in one and 0% coverage in the others. No correlation. And I was trying to figure out, but then I noticed that there were patterns that the students who were doing well on one passage, oftentimes there were correlations between students. That is, students who were doing well in passage 1 maybe did poorly on passage 2, but those were also the students who did okay on passage 3, really well on passage 4, and really badly on passage 5, if that makes sense. So that even though an individual student, you couldn't look at an individual student and say, if this student does well on one passage, they're going to do well on other passages. You could sort of group the students, and that students who would do well on one passage, you could predict what that student would do on another passage by what another student who had done well on passage 1 did. Does that make any sense? Okay. And that leads me to believe that actually there are many strategies students are using. Some of them are good for some purposes, some passages. Others are good for other passages. Different classes, different teachers, different readings require different strategies to identify what is important. And students often have figured out a strategy, or two, or three, but they don't know which strategy to use in which context. And so people may, at some level, know this is how I should be looking for importance, but how you look for importance depends on context, and people aren't good at determining how the context informs what strategy they should use. So what's the solution to this? I don't know. Invite me back in 4 years, maybe I'll have solved it by then. But for now, all I know is that a couple of things. First of all, note-taking is really hard. Students don't innately know how to do it well. If you give them the tool, they will oftentimes write down the wrong stuff. They oftentimes are just not sure what to do. There was a workshop earlier on how to help students do a better job of taking notes in ways that are helpful to them. Most students are never trained on how to take notes. It's the sort of thing, well, of course, you just take notes. You write down what you think is important. It's actually very hard, and it's not something that is natural, and because we don't spend a lot of time on it, we actually are doing our students a disservice. Second thing is that figuring out what's important is also hard. People also don't seem to be innately good at it. We don't seem to be training it very well, and I would say if I were setting an agenda, as we learned yesterday, we set an agenda for what research we should be doing and how cognitive science can inform university education, I would put this as a high priority of something we should be thinking about in terms of those soft skills, if you will, critical thinking, identifying importance, etc. And obviously this is going to be different depending on the discipline, but I think this is really important. And finally, for what it's worth, laptops are not bad in and of themselves. They can be useful for certain purposes. People sometimes say, well, do you think that laptops are bad? The answer is no, I don't. I require students to bring laptops to class. I just don't let them take notes on them. There's all sorts of reasons that laptops can be good for education, but we need to think about what it is that laptops do in terms of pushing students towards different learning strategies. And one of the things that laptops do is they nudge towards less effective note-taking strategies. They make people want to take notes verbatim, and that hurts their ability to understand the content as it's being presented, although it does help with external storage. So, certain things, if you're doing a task where the really important thing is that they have an external record, sure, laptops are great. But if the goal is that they learn and conceptually understand the material at the time, then you should probably try to get them not to use laptops. So those are my final thoughts. So thank you very much. Buy my books. Sorry, got to put that up there. If I make a sale today, then I'll be happy. It'll double my sales. Anyway, thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions if there are any.